It's my great pleasure to meet with my friend and colleague, Cilla Ross. And I just wonder if Cilla could introduce herself before we start the interview.
Thank you, Sharon. Hi, lovely to see you. I'm Cilla Ross. Sharon and I've got to know each other pretty well over the last couple of years. Worked on the Adult Ed 100 project. In terms of working life, I currently am interim principal at the Cooperative College, but my background has been higher education / adult education. So I left school at 15, and then when I was 25, through my trade union, I went to Coleg Harlock, and got involved in adult ed, and ever since, really, that's been the not just that, but that's really where my focus has been, is how we think about and develop new knowledges. So I've ended up at the Co-op movement, which is a very interesting place to be, but also very creative, intellectually and pedagogically. So that's a bit about me.
Oh, fantastic! Thanks, Cilla. So we've been enmeshed really with our particular interest in community and culture and our connections with the Adult Education 100 movement, and particularly getting the interviews out there with people who've experienced community and adult education and in different forms. So that's been it's been tremendously important for me, I have to say. I guess what I really want to do is to kind of trace back your experience of Raymond Willaims, because I know he's been a really important influence on your life and your thinking. And I wondered if we could start by me asking you really where your first relationship with him grew, where you first encountered his work, and perhaps which particular piece of work really influenced you to begin with.
Thanks, Sharon. I mean, I first heard the name Raymond Willaims, and there's a big hint in when I said that I went to Coleg Harlock. I studied politics and literature at Coleg Harlock, and that was around about 1979. 1980. And I had a great pleasure in sort of learning about some of the Welsh poets like Idris Davies, who wrote a fantastic poem on the general strike, and Dylan Thomas and so on. And I didn't read any Raymond Willaims, but Lewis Lloyd, who is my tutor, was a Raymond Willaims nut. He was, as he described himself, a philosophical anarchist. And he and I joined the Marxist Reading Capital working group, and I started to think about Marx. I was a working class kid, so I hadn't done any of that reading really before. And I came and heard about people like Raymond Willaims and E.P. Thompson, people who'd done more, if you like, fundamental Marxism. I was bringing, with Lewis's sort of engagement and help and support, probably a much more. I was reading that alongside Kropotkin and Bakunin and the sort of the anarchist writers. So I sort of heard his name there, but it didn't go any further. Where I started to think how important Willaims was to me and my thinking and my life, I guess, was when I won an ESRC scholarship to do my PhD. At the University of Sussex, and that was in 1987 or 8 or something like that. So it was a master's, and then subsequently a PhD. And one of the reasons why I encountered Willaims was because my supervisor was Stephen Yeo, who got me really thinking. And the book I'm going to say that most influenced me is not perhaps one you'd expect from Willaims, because and I'm going to hold it up, Sharon, so you can see
absolutely.
Find it. It's no longer got a cover. It's in 2 pieces.
Well used, obviously.
Well used, but it's television, technology, and cultural form.
Okay.
So this is not all the ones you think like, the long revolution.
Absolutely.
It's a little book, and the reason why it's this one, and I've even had to rewrite the title. The reason why it's this one is because my my PhD was about, well, first of all, it was looking at, my grandmother was a weaver in Nelson, in North East Lancashire. She was a production princess, and after the war in the textile mills, and I sort of got a sense that actually, because I had a very strong politics, I felt that you might look at places like Nelson and just say, well, everybody there is, and it is very much was a mono-industrial town, 90% of people worked in weaving. That was the, everybody just did that. And they were basically, I don't know, it was early industrial production, and it was pretty unskilled and all that sort of thing. But what was really massively impacting on it was technology. But what I'd started to understand was, of course, and this is what I experienced, was people might have been in a job that to the observer looked mundane and unskilled and all the rest of it. But actually, that's not necessarily how people saw it.
No, not at all.
And what I developed in my thesis was an idea of machine-mindedness and machine consciousness. Because what was extraordinary with the 70 odd people I interviewed for this was the sort of sense of identity they most of them had around pride in their own work and pride in the way that they'd use the technology. And so it's classic stuff. You go and people say, I've still got bits of material, and they bring out from under their bed bits of cloth that they'd woven. That sort of identity of, well, you were special if you're a weaver in Nelson, not like Burnley down the road. It's probably, a lot of myth and imagination, but it doesn't matter because, as you know, what it gave people that identity, and it made them then have agency. So what people were then doing is you had, in the 30s, it was a little Moscow, Nelson. It had a massive union density. Women and men got the same pay. It had a very strong radical history, as it did a lot of those districts at that time.
Absolutely. And is that what you focused on, Cilla, in your thesis? Or
to an extent? I mean, what I looked at was the impact of technology on those changed relationships. So from the 30s, then right through to the 70s and 80s, when you had for example, you had a massive change in the labour force. So you'd have the machines being destroyed. I'm talking very emotionally with people who'd have the same looms through 3 generations and had a massive attachment to them. But of course, as the technology had impacted, they'd gone from having their own 4 looms, and this is within lived memory, their own 4 looms, to suddenly there'd be 2 people controlling up and down waterjet looms rather than the old Lancashire loom or the power loom. So that's a sort of roundabout way of saying, but the wider discussion around this was the idea of technological determinism. That's progress. That just sort of happens anyway. Technology drops out the sky. And what Stephen said to me was, read Raymond Willaims about the intent around technological change. In other words, that the social relationships around how new technologies are introduced, the power relationships. And if I may, can I just read this bit, because
absolutely,
this is what really got me. Now, this isn't actually from television, but it's what I'll just see where this is from. Sorry. But it's funny actually, because he's everywhere right through this thesis, and I haven't clocked it really till
until you look
back. Sorry, Sharon. Sorry, this is from The Country and the City. So he says, so what Willaims did was to lay bare the reality of those relationships, how capitalism and technological determinism can obscure. Because I was grappling with this technology thing because my anarchist bit, my Morris bit, my Morris bit. So I was and even reading the best of Marx, you know, fishing in the morning, doodling in the afternoon.
Yeah.
You know, I always believed that technology was liberatory, but I was looking around me and it was causing havoc and
absolutely
and de-skilling in the, you know, the genuine
in a real sense,
in a real sense, and people were mourning that. Even though to me, I think, well, actually, you're only looking at an old loon, but they didn't see themselves like that. They saw themselves as highly skilled. So that had massive impact. So William was saying, you'll be probably familiar, an immensely productive capitalism in all its stages has extended both the resource and the modes which, however unevenly, provide and contain forms and response in its effects. It is then often difficult, past this continuing process which contains the substance of so much of our lives, to recognise adequately the specific character of the capitalist mode of production, which is not the use of machines or techniques of improvement, but their minority ownership. That's
the point.
Yeah. When we have lived long enough with such a system, it is difficult not to mistake it for a necessity and a practical reality, whatever elements of its processes we may find objectionable. But it is not only that the specific histories of country and city and of their immediate interrelations have been determined in Britain by capitalism. It is that the total character of what we know as modern society has been similarly determined.
That's so brilliant, isn't it? It's so powerful.
It's so powerful.
And it's that immense lucidity that he has, this kind of really, what's the word? He absolutely destroys these common sense ideas, doesn't he? And he kind of uses this laser-like intellect to get behind that.
Absolutely.
Which is why I love keywords so much, you know, expose this.
Oh, I love keywords. Yeah.
Expose this, you know, and that's what he does. It must have been an incredible, I mean, I wonder how exhausting it was to be him. I've often wondered that, you know, to have that kind of consciousness all the time.
Yeah, but you know what? I think he had such clarity that promptly once he got there, that was the lens he would always use.
Yeah, you're probably right, yeah.
And it probably just is, I mean, a bit like how maybe these things, I mean, you know, actually, maybe I'm not saying I'm like Willaims, but you arrive at a sort of positioning or you're thinking.
Yeah.
And you're always testing it and teasing it and playing around with it. Yeah. But actually, what really shocked me and what thrilled me in a way was I thought, actually, Cilla, 91, you know, I was on the way to where I am now, and I'm so glad I'm glad I've seen the world this way.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's a bit like when I first encountered him. I don't know if you experienced this. So it was like meeting someone who articulated your best thoughts years before you had, almost. And it was like discovering kind of gold or something. That's what I felt like. You know, wow, this person's articulated all these ideas.
Yeah, it's validating, isn't it? You know,
it's fantastic. And you're wrestling with them yourself. You might have been more coherent than me, but all these inchoate ideas that were kind of milling around in my head that I couldn't quite argue, you know, clearly. And he's got them there, and they're written down. It's just this revelation, really.
Well, I know, and I think he, so I sort of knew that it was about power because I'd read Marx and I knew it's about ownership control.
Yeah.
But what he to me, as you've said, articulates so beautifully there, is the way the obscuration, you know, how that, and that's actually one of the reasons. He also led me rather strangely, I don't know what he'd have thought about it, to situationism, you know, the society of the spectacle, which I do think is really interesting.
It is really interesting.
The way that people sort of see and actually, and certainly in recent events, you and I have talked about this, you know, our realities are just so different that they really see the world like that. And I cannot see it like that. And they can't see the way I see the world.
Yeah.
And you know, so rather amusingly, I often think that, you know, I sort of got, I didn't become a situationist, but it made me read that notion of how you obscure things, and it's almost like magic tricks.
Yeah, sleight of hand, isn't it?
Yeah. So it was massively important. So what started with I mean, I don't know if I've explained it very well, but
you do, yeah.
It was just it was a way of trying to understand things, but it reinforced my belief that the technology wasn't the problem, it's the ownership and control of it. And I don't think Willaims, I don't know what his view was about technology, but I don't think he saw it as a problem, you know, or I certainly didn't see, he wasn't a determinist, but I think he saw liberation in such things. But you know, so it was massively important. Just the other thing on this, perhaps this is less perhaps relevant to me. It's perhaps a more general view. Keywords, yes, at this time, because, and I'll never forget Steve Muir saying, you must read that book because it's a very brave book to put yourself out there. I'm just choosing those ones, and I thought that's right. But the country and the city, and the way Willaims talks about golden age, you know, you and I've had discussions about nostalgia. This is in here as well.
Yeah.
It's one of the things, as you know, one of the big tensions with oral history is, I mean, I think it's become more sophisticated ways to think about it now. But then, you know, sort of late 80s, there was a lot of, well, I used to have my clogs on and my shawl, and, you know, and I was a bit thinking, oh my God, I really respect all this, but actually that's just what so-and-so said. And so,
yeah.
How do I make sense of this? And there was a lot of nostalgia, but it's in this thesis that I started to think about nostalgia and how it can actually be agentic as well.
Yeah.
So I read Willaims writing about this sort of continuous, you know, the golden age, that how do you ever catch it? Because everybody writes about a golden age. And
exactly, and that makes me think about the lived experience, but also that idea of life history versus life story that you and I have talked about. And I've thought a lot about somehow you're trying to capture the real essential experience and not just a kind of superficial story, if that makes sense. So it's that individual within the context of the social, the political, the economic, you know, but it's their essential consciousness, not just what they wore or just what they ate. There's something, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but there's something kind of not just superficial, but individualizing about a life story in that way, isn't there? And I guess what I like is that life history, it is about a more collective experience, but a universal experience, which is what makes great literature as well. It doesn't have to be something you've experienced, but you can relate to the experience and you can process it. Do you know what I mean? I
do, and you know, without preempting the second question, I mean, that does take me into structures of feeling and how you can, you know, because that became the other big thing that I took out of this period.
Yeah,
and I think why I'm relating it to what you've just said is how you try and explain how you try and explain dialectics, actually, in terms of how people, what you see in a society and beliefs and cultures and identities, how they can all exist at the same time, apparently.
Yeah.
And, you know, but they are collective ones. And I think that's what's interesting for me. It isn't just about, I mean, it is about what you experience as an individual. But I don't think Raymond Willaims was talking like that. For me, it was about the bigger, I mean, you know his work better than me, but to me, it was about the bigger, the collective, the social.
Exactly. And trying to frame and understand people's lived experience, structure, feeling so important for that. You know, how do people express themselves in a particular culture or period? I mean, it's so important. And it's not just the obvious, the art, the literature, it's the kind of day-to-day. Going back to, can I go back to structure feeling and the second question I was going to ask you anyway, Cilla, because that kind of leads on to it. So you've said something about how it resonated with you and what it meant to you at the time, and I guess structure of feelings continued to influence your thinking. Would that be fair to say? and maybe we can explore a bit about how you feel that that's happened, or how it's impacted on your thinking.
Yeah, I mean, this I'm going to sort of describe it or define it crudely, I think, for me, and I know it is, but it has been hugely impactful, because even when I looked at what was going on in Nelson, you had the dominant, the residual, and the emerging, in terms of, even though it looked like, I mean, I use Orwell in this thesis because I've got a love-hate relationship with Orwell. Sometimes
yeah, me too.
Same. But, if you listen to him, I mean, God knows what he's always going on about the working class smelling and things like that, isn't he? But he also talked in the Road to Wickham Pier, I thought, that sort of, I mean, those, the probably just like in the mining communities, but, as powerfully, the rhythm of the clock and time and the machine totally affected everything. And, there was like 3 or 4 big owners in every town, and, the wakes, everybody went on holiday at the same time. And so it looked it looked like a really sort of mechanized society.
Rigid.
Really rigid. But of course, it wasn't like it wasn't like that. It was messy and all the things you expect from human beings. And so within once you, I mean, that is the beauty of using that sort of methodology. Is of course once you drill down and you unpick and you spend time with people, you see that every individual has those different elements within them as well as their contexts. So they're hanging on to things from the past. There's the dominant thing, but there's also what they're working towards or what they're feeling towards. And so how do you explain within a household you've got, I'm just using a crude political analysis, but, an absolute Tory activist and an absolute Labour activist. Someone who's passionately pro-union, someone that's totally anti-union, based on their shared experience. They've both worked in the mill all their lives. They've both done,
absolutely.
What?
Completely different consciousness, isn't it? Almost.
Totally. But bringing it, being so informed, they see things differently, and their expectations and hopes are different, and they're affected differently by the dominant culture, I think. And it's so. I mean, where I ended up with Raymond is not that I've ever been sectarian by any means. In some ways I wish I had, but it is absolute dynamics going on all the time, dialectics, I mean, really feeling that. So whether that be in the individual life and having that sense of those different spaces in every individual. And
that shift constantly.
And certainly communities. But then I went on and did it much more in my work around work, and what work in work identity and work community.
So where did you go with that, Cilla? Because you did your thesis, and then what happened with your thesis? Because obviously it sounds like it was, a really important piece of work. I mean, I don't know what you did with it afterwards. And,
nothing, because I had a baby in the middle of it.
Right.
So that was a bit
your own life experience,
which is really nice, But it wasn't, So I think by the time I had my Viva, I think Eleanor was about 4 months old.
Right.
So but it didn't take 2 years. It's where it went was I knew I'm without bigging it up. I thought, because I think the machine consciousness thing was quite pioneering at the time.
I love that.
Yeah, and Ray Paul was really into it. And I just, maybe I'll get back to it one day. Maybe it's something we'll do together. But what it did do was, I then went into a career really, which was around working with the WA, out in communities, developing oral history initiatives, social history initiatives, contemporary history initiatives. But nearly all around work and identity. Because work's been my big thing. I've always been really interested in work, probably because it's been the major thing in working class people's lives.
Absolutely. And were you located in sociology when you were at university then?
History and sociology. Yeah, when I did this, it was in sociology.
Yeah.
But then I was sort of across into history as well, because I did spend quite a lot of time looking at the sort of the way that the guilds emerged around work, and so I've always been very interdisciplinary, or even multidisciplinary.
Yeah.
But it was a conscious decision, going and working as I did. I was always attached to a university, so I worked at Sheffield, but I only did that sort of 2 days a week.
Yeah.
The rest of the time I was out with the WA and people like that, sort of around the time of the miners' strike, actually. Sort of really trying to. I saw this as political work.
Absolutely. That sounds like an amazing life, where you were juxtaposing at least an element of your adult education passion, your community activism, and some research, and it must have been quite a fruitful period for you.
Very much so, and actually, to be honest, I've sort of more or less did that. I did that at Leeds, where I was the WA University of Leeds person, mainly with labour education and then trade unions. But that's why I chose them to go to Working Lives Research Institute in London Met. It was an independent, had some really brilliant people within that little institute, within a very troubled university. But that's where I did probably my biggest piece of work around Willaims, which I think I've sent you, which was the Sphere project, which was like 6 or 8 different European countries.
Yeah.
Which were looking at work, but using Willaims as the sort of the conceptual and intellectual framework to look at dominant, emerging, and residual, but around work. So but work cultures, but how that impacted on the technical, the gendered, but looking at the emergence of new social movements and how they coexisted alongside the decline of others,
really
and what that meant for the politics of a place.
Yeah.
But that was a 4-year piece of work, and I used John Kirk as my colleague on that, who you've read his book, and sadly died in the middle of it. But so I carried on with that work for John.
So powerful.
Yeah. But he was an absolute William. He was not as well. So I've met probably the best people I've ever met in my life have been Raymond Willaims nuts.
Yeah.
And that's interesting.
It is interesting. And were they, this big research project that you describe, when was that taking place, Cilla? Was that in the 90s?
Yeah, it was. Let me just think. It was no, it wasn't actually. Let me just get this right. It was that 2008.
Oh, right. Which
one?
Yeah,
2008, 2012. Yeah, maybe even a little bit later, actually.
Yeah. And was it oral history based as a kind of, because that's amazing for a European project.
Yeah, well, that's actually when I did my BNIM training.
Yeah.
And so I've done sort of traditional oral history training with the Oral History Society, but I've never done that sort of level of intensive work.
That's biographical narrative inquiry methods, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Just for the purpose of our listeners.
Yes, sorry, yeah. But using that very and Joanna Bornack and has written about this. It's quite different to oral history.
Yeah.
But it's very interrogative.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting way of doing interviews. But you're quite right. It wasn't necessary, although, funnily enough, you'd have loved it, because the countries that were involved, it was Turkey, Germany, Sweden, UK, Greece. And because we were, the sectors we'd chosen was mining in each country.
Right.
Mining, textiles, and entertainment, the three.
That's fantastic.
But in a way, as you would expect, you had very empathetic and interesting academics.
Yeah.
Who'd been studying mining and textiles, you know what I mean, and culture.
Yeah.
So actually, although they perhaps haven't always, although actually the other country involved, I was saying this to Poland. Now it was Adam who actually got us involved in Benin. So that's quite common in Poland, that sort of interrogative work. You know, I mean, you asked a very good question there about, you know, what we were trying to expose in that project was to try and understand the relationship between the different structures of feeling within communities.
Yeah.
You know, so, you know, the classic one, because I suppose why we chose those industries that we did, it didn't matter where they were. By that time, you know, actually it was about 2012. It was about 2012. By that time, you know, mining was still going on quite richly in southern Poland, because actually it driven out a lot of the global northern mining. But actually, it was a race to the bottom. It was a very precarious sort of job.
Yeah.
But you know what impact did those industries still have on their communities when either they were in decline, had gone, or you know were just sort of
we must expose this whole idea of left behind communities, because this infuriates me. I mean, this kind of language, it's so lazy, isn't it, in a way? Because these communities are not just, they're not left behind. I mean, looking at around here, where I live in Plesley near Mansfield, as you know, and that infrastructure of people, the way they connect with one another, their shared memories, their shared cultural artifacts, if that's the right word, and experiences remain, but the work doesn't. So, you know, it's almost like the kind of central reason for the community existing has gone. And that's what I think about this crucial importance of work. I've just been reading about the 113 academics, I think it is, who are being let go, made redundant at the University of Leicester.
Yeah, I know.
And the reasons they've been given, and the kind of
what reasons have they been given?
Well, most of it seems to be that they're using a critical lens, which is absolutely terrifying, you know, as a critical management lens, or that they're coming from a sociological perspective, and it's not in line with the university's strategy, or whatever the hell that means. I mean, I've looked at these various, they've done cards for each individual academic, giving a bit of an explanation and giving some information about why they're being made redundant. And it's quite very frightening, because it's anti-intellectual, frankly, as I see it. But it's almost like being a critical thinker is not just dangerous at the moment, but it's actually being stamped out. And this is why I seek Raymond Willaims even more fiercely than ever before, because he was nothing if not an incredibly astute critical thinker, and he critiqued everything. I mean, he, like you said, he may well have come to a kind of accommodation with his own ideas that inform the rest of the way he thought, and perhaps the way he thought for the future. But you know, that intellectual rigor, that process, you know, this is really scary stuff. And this,
you know, I know, and but you know what I'm starting to, I mean, this is a funny thing, and I don't mean this to sound negative or weird or ageist or anything. I'm being a human being. One of the things that I'm starting to freak out a bit about is what happens when things really get lost. Like,
I know
you're in a place, I mean, like, if I go into the middle of, I mean, I live in Home Firth, which is a very middle class country sort of white flight sort of place, you know, if I'm honest. It is, you know, I mean, it's got its pockets and all the rest of it, and there's no work, but it's an older demographic, and other people just commute, you know. You go into the middle of Huddersfield, that's a different matter. My God, that's poor, you know. It's just boarded up, the whole bloody place. But it's still, you still see people shuffling around, and they I'm not being disrespectful, but they tend to be a much older group who do remember working in the mills, do remember Huddersfield being somewhere to go on a Saturday night out and all that sort of stuff. But what happens then when they die? What happens when it's not in the lived experience anymore? And I'm having to, certainly in my role at the college, of having to engage, and wanting to, but having to engage new people who they're not just kids. They've actually had a cultural and political life with some responsibilities. Overall, they're decent people,
Yeah.
They've probably got to their mid-30s or something like that.
Yeah.
Their history is, we don't live in the same country.
No.
And I'm not mourning it. It's just, so if they came, not only is it because, if they came to the centre of Huddersfield or Liverpool, where I'm from, I go to Liverpool and I'm overwhelmed actually with memory, in good and bad ways.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't mean the same thing, because they wouldn't have those connections.
It's weird, isn't it?
Or do they though, Sharon? And do those structures of feelings apply to them in the same way apply to us?
Well, they must do, but it must be very different, which is why I wrestle with structure of feeling. I really do. But I guess it is particular to a time, isn't it?
When he was writing.
Yeah, and also the time he talks about structure of feeling being. I made some notes on this because it always eludes me, but I think the idea about it transcends a fixed or historically defined experience, but it is also marked by that time and that time frame when we're experiencing it, isn't it? If that makes any sense. So
yeah, it does.
It's got to be different for them, but they must be having that experience of connecting to a place. And it's funny because I've just started to really feel that sense of loss and nostalgia, and it acts in strange ways. So I go to St Pancras, and for many years I had jobs which took me to London regularly. Though I didn't work in London, I worked in Sheffield and Nottingham predominantly, but I'd go to London frequently. And I remember going to the old St Pancras.
Yeah, the old
those steel bars that were bloody uncomfortable, with no bench, nowhere to sit.
And as a smoker, I'd always be outside.
Yeah, all smoking, yeah. and having that and that kind of really rubbish little pit stop store immediately in front of you, and kind of right next to the Railway Inn or whatever it's called, because I'd always be going towards Chesterfield. And I go there now and I feel this sense of loss, even though it's a beautiful structure.
Yeah, it's the champagne bar.
Yeah, because it's a topography, a landscape that doesn't correspond with the one in my head anymore.
I know.
And that's the kind of change that I think we're experiencing. But
But I'm finding it hard, and I've got to stop. I've got to stop feeling, well, frankly, quite weepy. Yeah. Sometimes. It's something. It's got to be something to do about aging as well, and loving life, and not wanting it to end, and all that. And exactly. It's got to be in the mix.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
But I know exactly, and I do feel, because I think I think it's important what you've just said about the structures of feeling and it being a certain time and place and context. It's true. It doesn't mean you don't have those different multiple contexts in any society at any time. But what happens when they aren't as distinctive, or they're not as for example, I've got generations I'm working with now who have always had a landscape of computers. Classic example, So, but they've not seen the sort of, I can still stomp around a town and I knew people who worked there, or that I remember the smell of that chimney, or was it exactly the same for you? Or walking with Nana around Nelson, and showing me the way across the fields with the stones in, so you could do it in the dark with your clogs on and that sort of thing. Well, I mean, they must have similar. I'm sounding like this slightly from a different country, but do they have similar overwhelming experiences that are so rooted to identity and community around work or politics or culture, or is it sort of different? I just don't know.
I don't know either, but it's I think what he does is I guess he gives me some courage to think, well, that must be the same for those younger people as well. They must be creating their own, or experiencing their own structure of feeling, their connection with the art, the music, the culture of that given moment, of that particular community. It must be similar to them. But what worries me is, well, not worries me, what saddens me is exactly what you've described, when that generational shift occurs. So thinking of my grandma, with her sitting in the Cross Keys in Bolsover,
Why not?
Fagging it and constantly drinking beer and going out and kind of working in the knicker factory, and nicking knickers basically and hoarding them at home, and and always stealing ashtrays from pubs and stuff. For some reason, she was a bloody kleptomaniac. But
but you just did it on principle, Sharon.
Exactly. But there was something incredibly real about her. She was so very real. She was so very much herself. There was no artifice. Somehow there was a kind of complete sense of absolute identity in her, unapologetically. There was no layering over by lenses, by filters, by social media, it was earthy. And there's something about that I think we are beginning to lose. That really frightens me.
You see, some people would say good, because you could equally, this is unscientific, but you could say, because that's exactly how I remember my grandparents, exactly, actually. And unusually working women, they went out to paid work as well.
She worked at the Byron brickwork.
Mine did, they both did. But their worlds were so much smaller. They could navigate those worlds in different ways and were perhaps more comfortable within them. I'm not saying it very well, but there perhaps wasn't the expectation. They had to manage things, and it was hard materially. But it was a closed, more sure. There were big things that disrupted, like wars and all the rest of it. But it was a closed world, and it was like that for hundreds of years, really. It didn't mean you didn't have lots of disruption within families and events and things happened. But it's not like now, which is completely, So some people would say, but that sort of life, where you had that certainty around
continuity, almost.
The continuity, and maybe you knew about the dominant, the dominant discourse, but that's just how it was, and maybe you just didn't.
But maybe,
But you did rebel because you stole knickers and ashtrays.
Yeah, and went out with blokes all the time and was generally badly behaved altogether,
Good on her.
She was a bit wild, my grandma. But, the thing was, I guess, it's a recognition, that kind of world, and that perspective, that memory is being utterly lost, isn't it? When that starts to disappear completely, it's like
But I think it's gone. I think it's nearly gone.
Yeah. And then you read about it in books, and I don't know. Is it? What I find really interesting, disturbing, perturbing, whatever, is you get people like Arthur Seaton in Saturday Night, Sunday Morning. You get, people who experience their work as a mental liberation, don't they?
Yeah.
You can't assume that because someone stood there at a machine or operating a pick down the pit, like, you know, like my dad would have done, or my granddad, you know, that they're not flying intellectually.
Of course.
And that's the kind of really interesting thing I find, you know, and that must still be happening. So that gives me courage. People will still be having imaginative journeys in their minds, whatever their age. And so, and I think structure of feeling is something about that. It's something about that kind of imaginative engagement with the community around you. And not just its physical artifacts or its cultural artifacts. It's about it. I don't, do you know what I mean? It's about that connection somehow.
And in a funny way, maybe this is something that does align with your life course. In other words, and hard it is to say this sometimes, but we cannot know what it feels like to be a 20-year-old living in the Dearne Valley. You know, if you and I went out now and went to the Dearne Valley, I would probably see, there'd be differences, but there would be people there. Yeah. And it would be the same as 20 years ago, 30 years ago, in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways. There might be groups of phone, you know, they might have worlds out of there, because of technology and all the rest of it. But then maybe that's been around a lot longer than we think. And I think Willaims talks about that very profoundly when he talks about the impact of television on community, you know, when the whole...
Even of books before that, you know, I was watching a program about that incredible mind shift when suddenly people are able to read.
Yes, yeah,
and see other worlds, you know.
Oh God, extraordinary. So that imagining is still going on. There's no, I wouldn't doubt that for one second. No. And perhaps the means of it are different, and perhaps the expectation and ambitions are different, and you know the reference points are different. But it doesn't mean